Welcome to the Ad Nauseam podcast, where classical gourmands everywhere can finally get their fill. Join us for a delectable discussion of Greco-Roman civilization stretching from the Minoans and Mycenaeans through the Renaissance and right down to the present. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here are your hosts, Dr. David Noe and Dr. Jeff Winkle.
Welcome, listeners, to episode 137 of the Ad Nauseam podcast. My name is Dr. Jeff Winkle. I'm down here in the bunker with my good friend and co-host, Dr. David Noe. How you feeling tonight, Dave?
I'm doing okay, Jeff. I think we call it the vomitorium,
Yes,
right? Isn't that kind of our theme?
Yeah.
Taking in the classics.
And keeping it down.
That's correct,
Right.
keeping them down. I'm doing okay. I got over some stomach issues last week. They were a bit debilitating, and now I have some sinus issues a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like one illness that just sort of travels around.
Yeah, indeed. I've got it too. I'm sure our listeners can maybe hear that in our voices this evening.
Yeah, I'm like a podcaster in resonance.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, well, that part of you hasn't suffered from from the illness.
You mean the terrible puns?
The terrible puns, they're back.
So I was driving home today.
Yeah.
This is not a pun.
Okay.
It's just a potentially amusing story. You know where 28th Street intersects with 131? That
do.
general area?
Yep.
You know, there's a restaurant there, El Pollo Loco.
Yes.
Do you know that restaurant?
I do, yes.
Yeah, they serve desayunos. They serve breakfast and so forth.
Yeah, the crazy chicken.
Yes. Have you ever looked at the logo that's over the door of El Pollo Loco?
I don't think I've ever paused.
It's a chicken. This is very disturbing.
Yeah.
It's a chicken with arms and wings. And not just normal arms, but big, muscular arms.
Wait, he has arms, but in addition to wings?
In addition to wings.
that's
right. It's not that the arms are taking the place of the wings. And these are not normal arms.
Yeah.
These are just massive, brawny arms.
Well, that's because this pollo is loco.
You think that's why?
I think so, yeah.
We were driving along, and I said to one of my children, look at that chicken. Can you believe that chicken has such muscular arms? And their reply was, I think it can take you, Dad.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go toe to toe with a winged and armed chicken.
That's right. Did you say toe to dough?
Maybe that's just
I think you
my
did.
stuffy nose.
So El Pollo Loco?
Yeah.
I don't think I'll be frequenting that establishment.
No.
The chicken it's just something off.
Right. So that logo in and of itself would turn you away.
Apotropaic.
Ah, there we go.
See, we connect it to the classics.
Nice.
In the same way that people who dedicated bronze cauldron
Yeah.
at Delphi would put a griffin's head on the rim.
They would.
In order to scare away evil spirits. Apparently, El Pollo Loco has put a large, muscular, biceps chicken above the entrance to
Scare
its
people
shrine
away from buying the
to
products.
scare away customers.
Oh man.
Is that plausible?
I suppose so.
Yeah, I don't
But
know.
next time I'm in that direction, I'm gonna
Check it out.
I'm gonna slow down. I'm not gonna stop, but I'm gonna slow down
Yeah.
to peer over there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, Jeff, how are you feeling this evening?
I'm probably, as our listener can tell, I'm not feeling all that great. I mean, my voice is rough, but I think like you, I'm kind of coming out of. The worst is behind me,
I think so.
and so but I'm looking forward to getting back into it. It's been a while since we've been at the desk.
Yes. Ad astra per aspera, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I was thinking, health isn't 100%, but if we don't record an episode soon, people are going to tune out altogether.
They're gonna bail.
That's right.
I know.
So we clawed our way in here, and what are we talking about tonight?
Well, we're back into the Marrou text. We're talking about the history of education in antiquity.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this is part 4 of our series on this.
This is Henri-Irénée Marrou.
Mm-hmm. Very nicely done.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I've been practicing all week. The extra layer of coating on my vocal cords probably helped with the French pronunciation.
Indeed. Yeah.
But before we get to that,
Yeah.
we have a shout out.
We do have a shout out. Yes.
And this comes from one Steve Westfall. Now, Steve gave us a very thorough description of what we might say about him.
Yeah.
And he said at the end, this was so gracious, as I indicated previously, please edit profusely. Sorry for being long-winded.
Yeah.
So can you edit on the fly, Jeff? You think we can, take things out as needed, maybe put in some other stuff we want to?
Sure. Yes. Let me start it. Let it start us off. He writes, early in college, I thought I might be headed towards ministry. So I took a year of New Testament Greek as a sophomore at SMU in Dallas at Southern Methodist.
I believe so.
After some uncertainty about that and a change of majors, I transferred to the University of Texas at Austin, where in the last semester before graduating, I took a 1-semester intensive beginning classical Greek course. So then, just looking ahead, I mean,
Right.
the number of languages that Steve has dipped his toes in is pretty impressive.
It's pretty impressive.
It
But
is.
I'm wondering about your metaphor.
What, but the dipping the toes?
Dipping of toes into the language.
Yeah, why not?
I don't know.
Okay.
Is it apt?
Is it apt?
Yeah.
I
Don't metaphors have to be apt?
no. I think people know what I'm talking about.
I'm just curious.
To dip one's toes in is to try it.
Okay,
right?
go ahead.
All right,
All right, sorry.
Okay, right. Maybe to stick one's tongue into the river of languages. Would that be better?
That's terrible.
That's terrible. Right, exactly. I'm gonna stick with my toes.
Stick one's finger into the dike of languages?
Something like that.
I was just curious.
Right.
Don't let me interrupt.
Sorry. Well, pick it up there. What else?
Okay.
What else has Steve done here?
He says, when I began a THM program that fall at Dallas Theological Seminary, I was able to skip the first year of Koine Greek. I had 5 or 6 Greek exegesis courses, but didn't develop my reading ability as well as I should have. This was partly due to sloth, but also, you got to admire a man who's honest.
Indeed.
But also due to a pedagogical method widely used in seminaries that emphasizes grammatical analysis instead of reading facility. I got a THM degree with a specialization in Old Testament Lit and Semitic languages. The languages included Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and Ugaritic.
How's your Ugaritic?
It's awful, but I have always wanted to study Ugaritic.
Really?
Mostly because of the name.
Oh, it's a great name.
It's impressive.
Yeah.
Ugaritic.
How many people walking this planet can say that they know any Ugaritic?
Not many.
Not many.
You want to continue?
Sure. He says, after that, I remained for a year in their THD program in Old Testament, where I had courses in Deuteronomy, Ancient Near Eastern History, and Akkadian. Mm-hmm. But I was not happy with the program and left for the University of Chicago, where I thrived in a doctoral program in Northwest Semitic philology, taking courses at both the Oriental Institute and the Divinity School.
Now, Akkadian, wasn't that one of the first games Atari released?
Yeah.
On the 2400?
Right. It was really kind of blocky and had just kind of like a bouncing square.
That's
around
correct.
Here. Right, exactly. But University of Chicago is, again, one of has to be kind of a dwindling number of places in the world where you can study these languages.
Yes. What they used to call Oriental languages and now they call Near Eastern.
Right, right. Yeah.
Founded by J.D. Rockefeller, actually.
Is that right?
Rockefeller money behind the University of Chicago.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep.
Yeah. He goes on. He says, I took more Akkadian, including Amarna letters and historical texts like Sennacherib's Prism inscription, in which he describes his invasion of the Levant and shutting up King Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage.
Now there's a metaphor. Notice Sennacherib wasn't dipping his toes into the politics of Jerusalem.
He might have, but I'm with you here. Okay.
Bird in a cage?
Bird in a cage,
All
right.
right, sorry.
I also studied more Old Testament literature, history, archaeology, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Ugaritic, there it is again, Phoenician, Punic, and other Northwest Semitic inscriptions. My
It's an
goodness.
Ugaritic callback is what that is.
That's right, exactly right. Yeah.
Steve says, I can relate one humorous anecdote from my time at the University of Chicago. Needing to pass a French reading test and never having studied French, I took a summer course for grad students in French reading knowledge.
I did that. Did you do that?
Yes.
Yes. That same kind of intensive.
Yes.
Yep.
He says, and I do mean reading, no emphasis on pronunciation at all. Mm-hmm. I also audited the first quarter of Latin at the University of Chicago. Later, when I had to write a philological paper on a Punic inscription from France known as the Marseille Tarif inscription, I needed to consult an important article on the subject that was written in Italian.
Oh, man.
I found that between my eager knowledge of Latin and my better knowledge of French, I was able to understand the paper in Italian and even quote from it in my paper. I guess that's called amore. Oh, I'm sorry. I misread it.
Synergy.
Synergy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's synergy, not amore.
I think you've probably experienced that having a grounding in Latin, and you realize he opens up all kinds of doors, and that if they
Like the door to the fast food restaurant. This is where you'll work.
Exactly. Right. I was thinking more if you encounter some sprinklings of Spanish, French, and Italian, you can usually make some sense out of it.
I have to say, I find Spanish incredibly easy.
Yes.
French is more challenging. I struggle with the pronunciation. But
Right.
Steve goes on.
Yes.
After all of that and taking comprehensive exams, he's in the information technology field, met his wife, got married, had our son David, and the rest is history. Of course, now Steve Westfall, his son David, was our student.
Yes, he was.
And we traveled with Greece to him. What did I say?
We traveled to Greece with him.
There you go.
Yes.
Preposition trouble. And the year was 2011.
I believe I think that's right. Yeah.
He traveled along, and we had a nickname for him.
Yes, we did.
Which we won't share. Because we gave nicknames to all of our students,
Yes, we
if
did.
you remember.
Yes, we did. Yep.
You want to pick it up there?
Sure. So he says, since my time at the University of Chicago, biblical studies has remained my first love. I've done a good bit of teaching in the adult education programs in the churches in the Chicago area. For 2 years, I even got to teach Greek to some eager parishioners who wanted to learn to read New Testament in the original language. I use the Athenians.
You're going to mention one of my competitors.
Oh, what's that? Oh, the book that's coming
He
up
meant
here?
to say,
Oh.
I wanted to use Moss method.
Oh, right.
But it wasn't available.
That's what he meant.
Okay.
I
Just skip
felt
over
too.
that, would you?
But he said he used the Athenians textbook, which I've used a couple of times in the past. Yeah. He is active in a parish of the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, where he's a ruling elder. He has a particular love for the theologian J.I. Packer. He sounds like he's very, very active in different societies. The Evangelical Theological Society, Society of Biblical Literature. And he says he just returned home last week from this year's meetings in San Antonio, where I was able to room with my son David and hear some very good presentations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yes.
That is a fascinating life.
Impressive. And I have to say that, Steve is not a young man, but
No.
the memory of everything that he did.
It's incredible.
And being able to kind of recall that he took this course in this semester.
That's right.
I
can't keep my CV up to date.
I can't do that now.
No, and
That's impressive.
yes, maybe by the age of 73, Jeff, we will have learned some Ugaritic words. We could make that like on our bucket list,
I can only hope.
our Buckaritic list, something like that.
Is there a particular work in Ugaritic that you'd say, "Oh man, I wish I could read that in the original"? I'm
Nothing I can think of.
no.
The strength of chickens, something like that.
We're gonna keep coming back to this, aren't
Possibility.
we?
No, I don't know. So, Steve, we really appreciate you being actually a patron of this podcast,
Yeah.
a great supporter, generous patron. We appreciate that. You and Mrs. Westfall out there listening, sending us ideas, sending us some great stuff. We really appreciate it.
Yes, indeed. All right, Dave, let's get into this. So we are back into the Marrou text, and could you give our audience just a quick overview?
So this is a history of education in antiquity, and it's part 4, written in 1956 in French by this man Marrou, Henry Irénée Marrou, a French historian who described himself as a Christian humanist, best known for his work, The History of Education in Antiquity, what we're covering today. But he also did work on sources chrétiennes, the early Christian letter to Diognetus, the only manuscript of which perished in a fire at the University of Strasbourg during the Franco-Prussian War.
Oh, I hate stories like that.
Yeah, I do too. But thankfully, he got a manuscript. He got a copy of it. So
Fantastic.
You know what's in it. So he wrote this work, and what he's doing is he's tracing the history of education in the ancient world, starting with Homer, specifically describing the transition from what he calls a warrior culture, a typical day in the vomitorium, to a scribe culture.
Right.
So moving away from the glorification of the solitary hero a la Achilles to someone who's not entirely in the mold of Odysseus, because Odysseus was still a bandy-legged hero, but Odysseus uses more brain than brawn.
Right.
And that's kind of the beginning of the development of the scribe culture, which was to become regnant in civilization.
Right. So in previous episodes, we were talking about how a lot of this, like the warrior culture, that form of education began with the Spartans.
That's right.
But kind of faded from Sparta fairly quickly.
That's right.
And then, as we'll see, things will rapidly transfer over to Athens, where we see kind of the more scribal culture take root.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thucydides described in the funeral speech of Pericles, through the mouth of Pericles, Thucydides described Greece as the education of the world and Athens as the education of Greece. Now, that's said with a great deal of, jingoism or patriotism, depending on your perspective. But that came to be the dominant view since that time. There's something unique about Athens, and it's particularly their mode of education. So when we approached this topic, a few episodes ago, we said this is a long book. We're going to interrupt it with some more occasional sylvae, that is occasional kinds of topics, but we're going to go through the whole thing a little bit at a time and examine this. And we gave some reasons, if you remember, right? Why cover this topic at all on a classics themed podcast?
Yeah.
What were some of those things, Jeff?
Well, we talked about how we ourselves were educated in the classical mode. We consider ourselves to be lifelong learners.
That's right.
And education doesn't stop when you leave school. It's an ongoing thing until we die.
That's right.
We ourselves are teachers. This is part of our profession. It's always good to kind of step back and ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And what do we want our students to get out of this? And then also a topic that we've kind of touched upon, but we'll probably, I think we'll save for a specific episode or episodes talking about this resurgence in classical education that's out there in America right now.
That's right.
And kind of what
the K-12 level.
At the K-12 level, right, exactly. And kind of investigating what do we mean, or what do these schools mean when they talk about come here and get a classical education? Does it have anything to do with what we're talking about in this book?
Right. And one of my contentions has been, it's not maybe a very popular contention, that as good as the resurgence in classical education is, it's often a poorly defined term. It's not really clear necessarily to the persons involved as to what they're doing, and there's a great deal of disagreement as to precisely what they're doing.
Right.
Some have said a classical education is the study of the ancient Greeks and Romans. My understanding now is that the persons who make that claim as the definition of classical education is a very rapidly diminishing group. And they see classical education more in terms of the formation of the soul and the cultivation of virtue in particular.
Okay.
This is a topic that's important to me as the classical world interfaces with the Christian world, because my contention is for all the overlap, for all the continuity and similarity between the Greco-Roman authors and the Church Fathers, the discontinuities are much stronger, and it's very easy to overlook them if one becomes enamored, as I am, of the Greco-Roman authors.
Yeah.
So that's just a little bit of a kind of a foreshadowing of some of the things we may be talking about.
Sure. And as I was reading the chapters we're covering tonight, one of the things that struck me is that, in trying to answer this question of what do we mean by classical education, if we were to try to answer that, well, to try to mimic or build upon what the ancient Greeks were doing in terms of education, well, that's a whole Pandora's box in and of itself. I mean, just reading these couple of chapters is that if we were to go back to the 5th century, you'd find a dozen different answers to the question of what an education should look like, right? So, I mean, this wrestling between a kind of sophist point of view where education is very utilitarian, it's very pragmatic.
Yes, strictly practical.
Practical. You do this to win in court, to win an argument. A more kind of broader response was saying, no, this education should be taught to teach excellence, right? To make good citizens. And so even amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans, there wasn't it's not a monolith.
There's no consensus.
Right, there's no consensus, right?
It's quite surprising. So as we get into the book, part 1, the origins of classical education, this is from Homer to the 4th century educator and orator Isocrates. And Isocrates was a contemporary of Demosthenes. He was a somewhat older contemporary of Plato, not to be confused with Socrates,
right,
but Isocrates. So previous episodes, we covered education in Homeric times. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2, Spartan education. The third episode, we dealt with the topic of pederasty in classical education, a somewhat delicate topic. Tonight, we're starting out with chapter 4, which is the, quote, Old Athenian Education, what Marrou calls the Old Athenian Education.
Okay.
So, Jeff, as we get into this chapter, can you read the opening sentence of this chapter? Because I think it's really helpful to see how he ties this to the comedian Aristophanes.
Sure. So chapter 4 starts out like this. I have borrowed the expression, he archaia paideia, from Aristophanes, and I shall use it as he did to denote the type of education current in Athens in the first half of the 5th century, before the great changes that were made towards the end of the century by the Sophists and Socrates.
Excellent.
All right.
So that is the watershed moment. Many people consider Socrates one of the sophists,
yes,
though he labors extensively in Plato's dialogues to distinguish himself from all the other sophists.
Right.
To the casual observer, he would be just another one of the sophists. He's another Protagoras, he's another Gorgias, he's like one of those fellows. But whether he belongs to the sophists or not, 399, right, which is the death of Socrates by execution with hemlock, That's the watershed moment, the end of the old Athenian education, the hierarchia paideia, and the beginning of something entirely new.
Right.
So this chapter is going to talk about what was education like in Athens prior to the death of Socrates, basically.
Okay.
So page 36, Marrou says, the decisive step has been taken from a warrior to a scribe culture. So, although this earlier type of education was old-fashioned and even archaic in comparison with classical education in its fully developed form, it nevertheless represented a considerable advance in the general evolution from a warrior to a scribe culture. So this quote places the chapter in the broad stream, right? We've moved away from Homer. It's not going to be like what we will see, say, at the end of the 4th century, 100 years later, but it's a decisive step away from the warrior culture into the world of the scribe.
Yes. Now, one of the things that I was kind of curious about, and I think that Marrou kind of, he touches on this, but is that it was never quite clear to me exactly why this shift is happening. I mean, I think we can kind of talk about this as kind of a shift from Sparta to Athens. And, the representative cultures, the warrior culture of Sparta and the more kind of philosophical culture of Athens, it's a different culture, and that's where just kind of the culture is moving. But I couldn't quite understand if Marrou gave us an answer as to, well, what exactly flipped the switch? Did it have something to do with kind of the moving away from the tyrants and towards democracy and kind of that particular shift and these other shifts go along with it? I mean, how would you kind of answer that question? Why do we have this shift from the warrior culture to the scribe culture?
Well, he kind of hints at this a little bit when he mentions Thucydides. I'm not sure it answers the question why, but if you see that third paragraph there, maybe you could read just the first sentence.
Sure. So he writes, according to Thucydides, the Athenians were the first to abandon the old practice of going around the streets armed and putting aside their armor to adopt a less violent and a more civilized way of life. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
There isn't really an explanation other than to say that Thucydides' remark is the Athenians decided we're not going to walk around the city armed anymore. We're going to lay down our weapons as private citizens and, act in a different way.
Yeah.
I'm not equating, just for the record, I'm not equating the abandonment of self-defense.
Right.
And the means thereto. I'm not equating that with civilization.
Right.
I'm just reporting what Thucydides says the Athenians did.
Right. Yeah.
And it was a definite demilitarizing of the society because there was no private police force and arms were carried in a kind of, there were a lot of factions within the state.
Yeah.
And there was constant warfare between the different tribes, something that we saw in previous times under this Pisistratids in particular.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think later on, Marrou says something along the lines of that, being a citizen soldier, of course, was very important to being an Athenian male, right? So, the Athenians didn't set aside the importance of being a soldier, but the role of being a politician comes to the fore, and even so much of this early education was geared towards what kind of education is going to make you good in the assembly.
That's right.
Right, and so that becomes much more important than your role as a warrior on the battlefield.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is what Marrou says on page 37. He says, it seems clear that military training had ceased to play any important part in the education of the young Greek. In this respect, Athenian education, which was to be a model and inspiration to the whole of classical Greece, had quite different aims from those of later Sparta. In Athens, children and young men were not regarded primarily as future hoplites and required to join up and keep in step for 13 years. In fact, military training seems to have played so small a part in this, quote, old education, that the historian, for lack of evidence, may justly doubt whether it ever existed.
Yeah.
So the disappearance of a military education, when we were going through the chapter on Sparta, there was a specific name for every grade level, and it was often something violent, right? This is the leader of this group, and you get beat up at this age, and then you go to the barracks at this age, and you don't come back until that age.
Yes.
Athenian culture was much less regimented.
Yes, right. And then he also talks about how over time that kind of that centrality of the warrior becomes sublimated to sport.
Exactly.
And so that becomes the place. It's on the playing field,
right,
where you can kind of exercise those military ideals and keep them alive, but without the bloodshed of the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Athenians did have compulsory military education. And this is something that Marrou describes on page 37, the so-called ephebia. Could you take us through that a little bit, Jeff?
Sure. Athens was later to develop a remarkable system of compulsory military training known as ephebia, whereby its young citizens were obliged to do 2 years' service between the ages of 18 and 20. But there is little evidence about it, and it does not seem to have attained its full development until the end of the 4th century. There has been a great deal of discussion about the date of its first appearance, but this can hardly be placed earlier than the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404. A kind of ephebia may have existed before that time, but then the word could only have meant the coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the adolescent's entry into adult life, not the military training of classical times.
Yeah.
Right.
So a general demilitarization of society, maybe the defeat in the Peloponnesian War. I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, because if we go into the 4th century, then we're out of the old Athenian education.
Yeah.
But one has to believe that the disillusionment that came upon the Athenians because of their defeat in the Peloponnesian War at the hands of the Spartans would have accelerated this departure from a militarized lifestyle.
Right. And even, Marrou mentions in that paragraph these coming-of-age ceremonies. I think we noted about how in Sparta, the coming-of-age ceremonies they went from kind of the symbolic to the actual bloodletting.
Right.
And it seems in Athens we have kind of the reverse. It's moving again. That's part of that abandonment of the military ideal is even in coming age ceremonies are kind of distancing themselves from something violent and having to do with arms. Yeah.
Now he gives a reason for this, and it lies in the difference between a democracy and autocratic government. He says on that same page, the new democratic tactic of using heavy infantry did not demand any very elaborate technical qualifications on the part of the soldier. Pre-military and paramilitary exercises were neglected. In Homeric times, there had been tournaments like that between Ajax and Diomedes at the funeral games held in honor of Patroclus. From these more or less mock battles, the succeeding age had inherited a kind of contest called armed combat, hoplomachia. But this had simply been a competition, a matter of pure sport, and in any case, it had hardly any connection with education. So in other words, to serve in the Athenian military, you were a citizen soldier at all times, so you didn't need the level of expertise that one saw in the Spartan training, for example.
Right.
So when you look back on it, we tend to think that I have tended to think, I should say, that the Spartans were the superior army in a generally violent and militarized world. I now think that probably is a little bit inaccurate. The Spartans were a superior army because they were a professional army. That's the reason. And the other armies were not as capable because they didn't spend all of their time training.
Yeah.
They came together like an actual militia.
Right. Yeah. And then I liked his point about how just the changing in tactics also influences is that as you move more towards like the phalanx type of warfare, you no longer need the daring do of the individual Homeric warrior.
That's right.
Right. And so if you're just kind of part of this
cog in the machine,
if you're just a part of the tank,
right.
Well, then it doesn't require this 24/7 training.
Right. Yeah. Speaking of which, this reminds me. There were these two goldfish in a tank.
Yes.
And one says to the other, "Hey, do you know how to drive this thing?" Anyway, I got that joke from Chandler. So Chandler, if you're listening, thank you.
Chandler, from Friends?
No.
Oh, so you actually know somebody named Chandler?
I do know someone named Chandler. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Okay.
I've never met one before. So.
He's a great guy.
Okay.
Gave me a killer joke, a cute little pun that people love.
Nice.
Don't they?
I think so.
All right, moving on. So we go on, and then Marrou gives us a very nice tripartite division here. 3 different sections here in Chapter 4. Democratization of the aristocratic tradition. Then we have the first appearance of the school. Then we have physical education, musical education, education through poetry, and literary education. So I think I said tripartite, but that seems more like about...
There was a few more parts
Yeah.
there. Yes, yeah.
That chicken has brawny arms. So democratization of the aristocratic tradition. Let's start with that first and foremost.
Okay.
Right? So Athenian education became democratized. That's the point of what we've been saying thus far. No longer highly specialized. Anybody could get an education. Wasn't wedded to a warrior Homeric ideal, but it kept closely to its aristocratic origins, says Marrou, page 38. And in its principles and organization, it remained an education for gentlemen. So Plato insists that this would always tend to remain the privilege of an elite, since few were prepared to suffer the sacrifices it entailed, and few could appreciate its advantages.
Yeah. Now, when I was reading this, I want to get your take on this, is that this democratization of education, where we have a move from kind of the elite to a broader section of society. Do you see a corollary with that in terms of how we think about how college education was 100 years ago as to what it is today?
Yes, I do see a correlation.
All right. In that, there's kind of in the culture right now, it's this idea, well, everybody should go to college.
Yes.
Right?
And I think on the whole, it's not a good thing.
I would agree with that, right? But maybe somewhere in the middle between what we have now and the idea that it was just for an elite class to to train the only classes that had the proper breeding to be leaders, right?
Yes, but it's very difficult to talk about these things without sounding like an elitist in the wrong sense. Well, I've had this conversation with people many times, and I say not everybody should go to college.
Right.
And they say, well, shouldn't everyone have the chance to learn? And I say, yes, of course. But that's not the same thing as saying that everyone should go to college.
Right.
I also don't accept the notion that everyone can equally well learn the same amount of material.
Right. Well,
Isn't it just patent that people have different capacities for different kinds of learning?
This should not be controversial.
No, but then someone might object, well, so are you saying some people aren't as smart as others? Yes.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Isn't that problematic? It's not problematic unless you equate, which I don't, intelligence with moral worth,
Right.
or dignity or value. I don't think that a less intelligent person is less valuable than a more intelligent person.
Right.
In fact, my experience is that I would, on the whole, rather spend time with less intelligent persons because they seem less intelligent than what? I don't know, the national average maybe?
Right.
Because they seem more pleasant.
Yeah.
And less given to be in error about things they don't know.
Right, exactly. When I think about my most unpleasant experiences as an academic, it's been at conferences and sitting through one insufferable paper after another and listening to squabblings about
inanities
about Yoda subscripts and such. Right. But I think that's so what you're describing is very different from again what Marrou describes is that. As education becomes democratized, the elites in Athens, it rankled them.
Yes,
right?
it rankled them. And so they found ways to carve out and retain some of the aristocratic privileges or penumbrae, right?
Yes.
I just marked myself out as a word nerd, I suppose, of what it meant to have an education.
Right, which is very different. It's a very different thing when you say not everybody should or needs to go to college, right?
No.
You're not saying that to kind of preserve an elite privilege.
No,
of course. I just wanted to make that clear.
Only if one thinks that having an expensive and extensive education makes one a better person.
Right.
If you believe that, then if you say not everyone should have that, then you're saying something morally offensive.
Yes.
But I don't accept that premise.
Yeah, exactly.
The problem is, I think that a lot of educated people do accept that premise. Mm-hmm. And so they only want to associate with persons who are like them in that regard.
Yeah. No,
is that possible?
I think that's very true. Yep.
All right. So can you read the second? We've gotten a little off topic, maybe digressed a little bit. But could you read the second paragraph here on 38?
Yes. Even well on in the 5th century, education was still mainly for the aristocracy, the great landed proprietors who had wealth and consequently a good deal of leisure, rather than the average Athenian who earned his humble livelihood as a peasant or a craftsman or a small shopkeeper.
Now let me ask a question.
Yeah.
Are you now in your educated PhD mind looking down on those little peons that are peasants or craftsmen or small shopkeepers?
Not at all. Not at all.
Just checking.
No. I mean, I have to say from, I teach at a community college, which I know from, I'm sure there are many academics at four-year institutions who would thumb their nose at a junior college.
They
right?
wouldn't dip their toes in a four-year college.
And so it's and having been there now for about 7 years, it's really kind of opened my eyes to. I mean, I find myself thinking a lot about this question of what is the purpose of a college education,
Yes.
right? And so, I mean, a lot of the language at a community college is very pragmatic,
Right.
And a lot of my students are there. I'm here for 2 years because I want to do this very specific thing, right? And when they wander into one of my humanities classes, they just a lot of them all I know is that I got to have 2 credits of this stuff,
Right.
And this class was open.
But then you make it sweet for them, don't you, Winkle?
But then I try to. I think about that. I've come to really kind of admire that.
Yeah.
I want to become an HVAC tech.
Yes.
And so, but I have to take this course of study, and I think my community college, to its credit, says, even if you're going to be an HVAC tech, that's something very specific, very
Right.
technical. Hey, there's you can be well-rounded in these particular areas,
Right.
And that applies. That anybody can do that.
Yeah. So the year was 2001.
Yeah.
Here's a little anecdote. And we were buying, my wife and I, our second home, moving out of a townhouse in Leesburg, Virginia, moving into a larger home in Winchester, Virginia, because we had kids now. And the guy who inspected our home inspector, right? In some ways, it's a skilled job. It's a valuable job. I don't think it takes years of education to become a home inspector.
Yeah.
I could be wrong. But anyway, he starts inspecting the home. Oh, what do you do for a living? I say with more than a little embarrassment, I teach at a local college. Oh, what do you teach? Still more embarrassment. I teach Greek and Latin. Oh, the classics. Yeah, I do. Then he starts quoting to me from Caesar's De Bello Gallico, what he learned in high school some 30 to 40 years ago.
So he was dropping all of
He
Gauls
was.
divided into 3 parts.
That's right. And I was so impressed. Not because I think people who have those kinds of jobs are not educated. It was just incongruous. I just didn't see it coming,
Right.
And so to me is an example of you can never judge a book by its cover. People will have surprising interests.
Yeah.
Irrespective of their formal education.
Now, an interesting detail in your story, though, is you mentioned embarrassment in saying
Well,
that.
yes.
Is it because is it kind of coming from, well, what I do isn't practical?
Exactly.
Like compared to what you're doing, sir?
You're doing something so useful,
Right.
If one of my students doesn't parse a verb correctly, I can make them feel bad about it for a few minutes. But if someone buys a house and the wiring's wrong,
Right.
There's serious consequences.
There's a lot more at stake.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, let me just finish that paragraph. Marrou writes, we can picture this aristocratic existence as the way of life, stripped of its warlike aspects of the Homeric knight. It was essentially a fashionable sporting world.
A fashionable sporting world.
Yeah.
So no more militarism,
No.
but still Homeric in the pursuit of sport.
Yes.
And this is how the Athenian aristocracy, when education was being democratized, this is how they retained their elite status.
Okay.
Isn't that interesting?
That is really interesting. Yeah.
So what was the sport that Marrou says, quote, always remained the exclusive preserve of aristocratic families?
Chariot racing.
Yeah. Because it's expensive.
It's expensive to have horses and a chariot.
That's
and
right.
to maintain that.
Yes.
Right?
You got to buy chariot wax. You got to change the oil on the chariot. You got to get the undercoating and the pinstriping and the finder's fee.
Right.
There's a lot that goes into a chariot.
Yes, exactly. And with the horses, I mean, you are spending money to feed an animal,
Right.
that, unlike a cow,
Is not producing anything.
right, or a chicken,
Yeah.
not giving anything back.
When was the
right?
last time a horse laid an egg?
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It has. So the animal is purely for conspicuous display,
Yeah.
right, of wealth. And I mentioned J.D. Rockefeller earlier in this episode as the money behind the University of Chicago, because I just read this biography by Ron Chernow, and he loved racing fast horses and later automobiles because
Rockefeller did?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I guess that was his one thrill. The one place he was willing to waste money was on horses and automobiles.
Interesting.
So for the Athenians, horse racing, chariot racing, and they also mention Marrou does hunting, right?
Hunting, yeah.
Because that's, again, not strictly necessary.
Right. It reminds me of like fox hunting.
That's right.
On the English countryside for like the elites with their jackets and their little helmets.
That's right, and their trumpets.
Yeah.
So take a listen to this, Jeff, and tell me what you think.
Okay.
Well,
some audio of an actual chariot race?
No. What do you think it is really?
That sounded like a Formula One.
Yeah. I dug that up on the internet
Yeah.
because I thought that's kind of an analog, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
To anybody can drive a car.
Right.
Right? You have a car, you probably have a couple cars.
Yeah.
How many cars have you owned in your lifetime?
Boy, probably
A dozen?
probably just south of a dozen. Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I have never driven in a Formula One vehicle. Have you?
No.
And I never will. I don't think there's any chance.
No, I think this is spot on too. And so I've been watching this documentary series on F1 racing on Netflix for a while, and indeed, they to get into the sport. I mean, the amount of money that you have to have, and for a lot of these,
What is the great cost? Is it's the gloves or what's the thing that they put, the hood ornament? Is that the expensive part?
that's just the tip of the iceberg, man. I mean, the amount of engineering that goes into this, the teams, the organization. I mean, it's millions of dollars, and so many of these teams are owned by these multimillionaires who
Saudi princes,
something kind of like that,
right.
But that have all of this money, and so they have to find some place to put it, and so they love racing, and so you have kind of these elites of elites in society that own these teams and organize these teams, and it sounds in many ways exactly like the chariot racers here. The level of the bar of entry into F1, it's not like, oh yeah, you go, you start on the little league baseball team, you work your way
up through the minor leagues.
No. Yeah.
Have you ever done any auto racing?
No.
Good.
I would be terrible at that. My goodness. Yeah.
Okay. Jeff, what about the guy with the long hair?
Oh yeah. Should we read a little bit more from Marrou here?
Because remember, we're in the category on the democratization of the aristocratic tradition.
Right. So Marrou writes, the aristocratic families were fond of giving their children names compounded from hip or hippos, the ancient Greek word for a horse. You may remember Phidippides, the name of that self-made man in Aristophanes' Clouds, coins for his son, because his aristocratic wife insists she wanted a name with hippo in it, like Xanthippos,
which is yellow horse.
Yellow horse, yes, or Charipos or Kallipidos. The incident is so vivid and significant for our present purpose that it's worth recalling. The mother dreams of a wonderful future for her son. When you are grown up and drive your chariot to town, like your great uncle, the illustrious Megacles, wearing the long tunic of the racing charioteer. But the father bewares the results of the education Phidippides has had to satisfy his mother's ambition. He has long hair, rides a horse, drives a 2-horse chariot, and dreams about horses when he's asleep.
So it's the dissolute life of the young man who has too much money and nothing worth doing, I suppose.
Right. That's such a great play. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's no surprise that Marrou brings the Aristophanes and this particular play up a lot in talking about education. Because, of course, in that play, his Strepsiades' son has gotten to all of these debt problems. Right.
He's blowing through money, through cash.
And so his Hail Mary pass is to go away to Socrates' think shop,
right,
where he can learn
the frontisterion.
Yes, to learn how to argue his way out of these debts.
Right,
that's the point of education. Yep. To become a silver-tongued devil in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm. And that's the inflection point between the Old Athenian education and the oncoming sophistic and Socratic world.
Yes,
which is just about to dawn.
Yeah.
So he concludes that particular episode. Marrou does. He says, in the 4th century, Xenophon, famous Attic stylist, who was a typical representative of the aristocratic class, Xenophon thought it worthwhile to write 3 technical books on hunting, on riding, and the cavalry officer. It sounds like riveting reading.
It does. I don't think any of those survive, do they?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. I think those are all lost works.
Yeah. So why was riding a reserved sport?
Why was riding what? I'm sorry?
A reserved sport? Why was it that not everyone could participate?
Oh, because it was expensive.
It was Formula One.
It was totally Formula One.
Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of Formula One,
Yes?
it's time for the ads.
Let's do it.
This episode of Ad Nauseam is brought to you by the good folks at Ratio Coffee. And Dave, I'm going to turn it right over to you.
What?
Because I think you have a poem.
No.
Yeah, for us about...
I have a limerick.
You have a limerick, okay.
I have a ditty.
Okay, you have a ditty, okay. All right.
Written by a strong-armed chicken, something like that.
Would you share it with us, please?
Okay, if I must.
Yes.
Percolate, drip, brew, and froth, but low quality, making you wroth. Then Ratio's your baby. Don't even say maybe, or old brew leaves you colder than Hoth.
Oh, a Star Wars reference.
I slipped in a Star Wars reference at the
Nice.
end, and you know what? I don't like Star Wars.
But you knew about the ice planet of Hoth.
I do, and everybody else likes Star Wars, so I thought I'd use it.
That was interesting. I mean, I heard those first two rhymes, and I was thinking in my head as you were going along, how's he going to close this out?
There's no way he's going to find a third word that sounds like froth, roth,
and
I got it.
Hoth, you dropped that bomb,
Yeah,
right?
I toyed with mispronouncing the word cost, like cost,
Yeah.
but I decided wisely not to do
Hoth
that.
was the right choice, right?
What are we selling here?
Well, we're not talking about Star Wars. We are talking about coffee here.
Coffee.
We're talking about Ratio Coffee. And we're talking about this company that makes these incredible machines, the Ratio 8, the Ratio 6, and coming soon,
The Ratio 4.
right, which is it promises to have that same high quality brew, but at a much more accessible, affordable cost.
That's right. More of a single serve.
Yes,
Fits in takes up less countertop real estate. Equally beautiful, equally well engineered and machined.
Yeah.
But Jeff, can you say a few things that you like about your Ratio 8 in the stainless steel, I think?
I have the stainless steel, the carafe. Yeah, I mean, I love so many things about it. I love the metal cone that I put my grounds in every morning. I'm always amazed by how long that carafe can keep that coffee hot. I get up a lot earlier than my wife does. I was up at 5 a.m. this
Oh
morning.
my goodness.
And so I brew the coffee right away because I want to drink it right away. And my wife wakes up a good 2 hours later, and it's still piping hot.
Wow, that expression, they used to say down on the farm, that was called being up with the chickens.
Yes, right. And I also go to bed with the chickens usually as well.
When do the chickens go to bed?
Well, this is when I describe my getting up and sleeping habits. My mother-in-law, she once said to me, "Oh, you go to bed with the chickens." So apparently, the chickens go to bed early so they can get up early.
Are you already a member of AARP?
Yes, I get their flyers in the mail.
Okay.
Already. Yeah, right. What were we talking about?
You were
again?
saying that
Yeah.
you get up much earlier than your wife.
I do.
And you make coffee, and a
Yes.
couple hours later, it's still fresh and piping hot.
Right. Now, a new listener might wonder, well, what's so special about that? You've got the scorch pad keeping it warm, but no, not here.
That's right. It's easy to keep coffee warm if you're constantly burning it.
Right, exactly. But it sits in this stainless steel carafe.
Hulking flagon.
The installation on this thing is amazing.
It is
and
incredible.
And I believe my wife could get up at 9, 10 o'clock, and that stuff would still be hot.
But the great thing is also the taste, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not burned.
Right.
Because there's an off-gassing mechanism to let the harsh CO2 off into the biosphere.
The bloom method.
The
right?
bloom method. There's
Yep.
a bloom, there's a brew, and then there's...
You're ready to go.
And so what is it that one does not taste in this coffee that has been brewed through the Ratio 8 or 6?
Well, our longtime listeners will know the answer to that question. It's the brackish tang.
That's correct.
It's completely gone.
So let's say, listener, you want to avoid some brackish tang.
Yep.
And you want to up your coffee game.
Yes.
And you want to support this humble podcast. Jeff, can you tell them what they should do?
Well, they should go to ratiocoffee.com, RATIO coffee.com. Check out these machines. They've got the Ratio 8, the 6, like we said, the 4 is coming soon. They have lots of accessories. They sell their own coffee. See what they got. But if you want one of these wonderful machines, type in the coupon code ANCO5R. And Dave, that'll get them
15% off their order.
Yes.
And you don't want to miss out on this.
You do not.
This episode is also brought to you by the great folks at Hackett Publishing. Hackett has offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Indianapolis, Indiana. And for these 53 years, they have been bringing affordable, high-quality translations of the classics and many other works of literature to a broad audience.
Right.
Jeff, just name 2 things, if you would, that you love about Hackett. Succinct.
I would say that unlike the kind of those stuffy elites of Athens at the time we're talking about, Hackett, they want the class to be available to the masses, right? And so they are one of these wonderful companies that, in the term we love to use, they are keeping the flame alive.
Right.
They have so many different translations of classical works, as well as many other places in academia as well, and it's affordable. It's high quality. It's affordable. It's attractive. Anybody who wants these texts, there's a low level of entry. It's great. Yeah.
Don't you remember I said just keep it to 2?
I'm sorry. I
Goodness.
get a little excited.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Remember when I said tripartite and then listed about 7 things?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. We'll let it go.
It's a problem we have.
Yeah.
Dave, what about you? How about you?
Affordability,
Yep.
breadth and scope of the things that they cover. I routinely get asked on social media and other places, so what do you recommend that I read for X or Y? And inevitably, I go to Hackett's website and see, I bet they have something, and lo and behold, they do.
Yeah.
Something excellent, and then I recommend, hey, use our coupon code. I can definitely recommend this as a quality text. I know the translation is going to be top-notch, like the one by Stanley Lombardo for the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Metamorphoses of Ovid.
Yeah.
Also the Ambrose translation of the Metamorphoses, and some big news to break, Jeff.
Yes. Mr. Lombardo, who is so well represented on this podcast and at Hackett, we're going to be interviewing him soon.
Yes, he's going to be a guest on our podcast.
So hopefully early in the new year, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't wait.
So, listener, you want to do a couple things, maybe? You want to expand your reading library with reliable and inexpensive texts. And secondly, you want to support this podcast, we hope. So here's what we think you should do.
You should go to hackettpublishing.com, check out their amazing catalog, find the text you want, drop them in the little satchel, and put in this coupon code AN2023, and that will get you 20% off your entire order. And Dave?
Free shipping.
Right. Check it out.
Okay, Jeff, as we get back into it, we're still in Chapter 4, the Old Athenian Education, and we're now in the section on page 39, the first appearance of the school.
Yes.
And I think the point here that Marrou makes, which is so insightful, is that when you have a new ideal being enacted in society or celebrated, you have to have new institutions develop to entrench that ideal and to preserve it and expand it.
Yes.
And what is that new institution that was developed?
The school.
That's right. Did I kind of give it away when I said first appearance of the school?
Yeah, you might have.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. But let's dig into that a little bit. Now, my sense is that, I mean, in the next chapter, it seems that Marrou in some ways kind of walks us back because he talks about the Pythagoreans, right? Which are, predate this. Well, I guess maybe.
Yeah, they predate this
a little
for
bit.
Sure.
And they founded something that we might call a school.
But it was a commune.
Yeah.
It had heavy religious overtones.
Right.
And it was built around a singular individual. So Pythagoras was more like an early sophist, I would say, than the kind of thing that Marrou is describing near the end of 5th century Athens. At least that's my take.
Right.
Because you could check in and out of these places. Parents moved their kids around from one school, one teacher to the next.
Yeah.
If you want to be a Pythagorean,
you're going to be all in.
It was a bigger commitment.
That's true. Okay.
You know, things like don't eat beans, don't poke a fire, don't jump over a iron rod. You remember that.
Right. Yeah. Never eat spinach with a chicken.
That's correct.
Something like that. Right? Okay. Yeah. I think he does make a point later on is that that a lot of kind of later schools maybe took their cue from Pythagoras,
yes.
But we're gonna make this more open, and we're gonna make it more I guess more kind of secularized, we would say. Yeah.
In the same way that public schools took their cues from the schools of the Jesuits and the cloisters and the monasteries and so forth.
Exactly.
So bottom of page 39, Marrou makes this very astute observation. The new education intended for all free men, so that's the democratic spirit, right? Was necessarily of a collective character, right? We have to all do it together. And this led to the creation and development of the school. This was a decisive step, says Marrou. It is of paramount importance in the whole of the subsequent history.
Okay.
So that's it right there.
Yep. Now, I think this, he goes on at the bottom of page 39. I thought this was really interesting. He talks about how the aristocratic poets Theognis and Pindar faithfully reflect the scorn and suspicion with which the old nobility reacted to this development. And he goes on to say that.
So no schools.
No schools.
Right.
Because this idea that arete, it can't be taught.
Right.
You either are born with it or you're not.
Right. And Pindar and Theognis, they antedate Socrates by 40 years or so.
Yeah.
Socrates is the one who really brought home this question, right? Could arete, valor, virtue, be acquired by teaching?
Yeah.
Or does it have to be something innate in the individual?
Right.
This is the question of the Gorgios, right? It's techne versus episteme. You can teach techne, you can teach techniques of how to do something.
Right.
But is that the same thing as true knowledge?
Right. And my sense here is that from an aristocratic point of view, the elites would say, well, no, we have the arete. We have the monopoly on arete. It's in our bloodline, right?
Right.
One of my recent myth class, I was talking about how one of the students asked, why all these stories about Heracles having so many children,
right?
And how this was used by elite families historically, saying, well, we can trace our bloodline back to Heracles as a way of kind of legitimizing their place in society. I think that links to this is that, that comes without saying, that it's in our it's in our blood,
right? And
the lower classes simply can't have that, and so teach them a skill, but as far as excellence, no, they
could never star in a tragedy, for example. They got no royal lineage.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So then, for the rest of the chapter, we have to move along a little more quickly here, but there are some really exceptional points to mention. First is physical education. So who were the teachers that were hired for these aristocratic elites? Says Marrou, the main feature of aristocratic culture was sport. And so in the old educational system, physical training occupied the place of honor. The aim of this training was to prepare the child for athletic contests, racing, the discus, the javelin, the long jump, wrestling, and boxing. So they hired an expert, a PT.
A PT?
Yeah, not a physical trainer.
No.
A paidotribes.
A paidotribes.
Paidotribes, the person who trained the child. His coach. He had a professional coach.
Huh.
You got 3 kids, and they've been in sports. I'm sure you're hiring private trainers for their basketball and other things.
Not a one.
No.
Okay. They could use it, though, let me tell you.
Yeah.
So there were these professional coaches.
Right.
That are, they're playing, this is a central role in
the child's education.
Yes.
For the aristocratic elites,
right,
who were seeking to distinguish themselves from the democratization of education in these new schools.
Right. And I think he mentioned something about like the Olympic athletes, the elite athletes who could afford to go and train at Olympia all year long, where that was off the table for your local Athenian yokel.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yep. What about musical education, Jeff? Page 41.
Yeah. So Marrou says, in the Republic, Plato, describing the education of the good old days, tells us that it was two-sided, comprising gymnastics for the body and music for the soul. From the beginning, as we have seen, Greek culture and hence Greek education had included, besides sport, an element that was spiritual, intellectual, and artistic all at once. In Plato, music signifies the domain of the muses in the widest sense, but in ancient education generally, music in the narrower sense of the word, i.e. vocal and instrumental music, came first in this category. Aristophanes has the children marching in crocodile.
Did you say marching in crocs?
Seems a little awkward. Not only to the gymnastics teachers, but also ace kitharistou, to the kither player or the music master, even if the snow is falling as thick as flour.
Interesting. So the next section, education through poetry, brings us to the person of Solon.
Who's that?
Solon, well, you know who Solon is.
I know, but
you're just pretending not to know.
Right.
Okay, well, dip your toes in this. Solon was... Solon was a pre-Socratic philosopher. He was a statesman. He was elected archon. He lived from 638 to 558, and from 594 to 593, he was a de facto ruler of the Athenian state. Someday we'll devote an entire episode or two to him and his poetry because he's fascinating.
Yeah.
But, says Marrou on page 42, the truly Athenian poet who, like Tyrtaeus in Sparta, embodied the nation's wisdom was undoubtedly Solon. He certainly had an educational aim in view when he composed his elegies, which appeared in the form of moral injunctions to his fellow citizens. It seems clear that he was looked upon as the national spokesman. Consider, for instance, the way he was quoted in the law courts and the assembly by any orator in need of authority, even by Cleophon and Demosthenes. So Demosthenes is at least 200 years later.
So he becomes a kind of authority along the lines of Homer. Simply by quoting Solon, you have the imprimatur of authority. Okay.
I was thinking he's quoted like, some of the American founding fathers, or you might quote John Locke or Rousseau or something, Voltaire, right? So we have here a few lines of a fragment of his poetry, and then we have a translation by R.S. Hayes. And I think this fragment really captures well the conflict that's going on between, the fading of the warrior culture, the arrival of the scribe culture, and yet the aristocratic desire to hold on to their elite privileges, even while democracy is taking over education.
Okay. You want to read this Greek for us?
Yeah, I'd like to read, let's see how well it goes. We'll read a few lines. So this is written in the elegiac couplet. We have one line of hexameter and a second line of pentameter. And it goes something like this. Demo men garadokatason gerasos son aparke. Times ut aphelon ut epordrexamenos. Hoi de chon dunamin kai chrei masen e son age toi. Kai tois efrasamen medena e kesakain. Estain dam fibalon krateron sakos fatoroisi. Nikon duke ea su deterus adikos.
Nicely done.
Thank you. And can you read the translation for us, Jeff?
Yes, this is from one R.S. Hayes. I gave the ordinary people a prize that is adequate for them, neither too much nor too little. And as for those who had power and were admired for their wealth, I made sure that nothing ugly would happen to them. I defended both groups with a strong shield. I allowed neither group to bully the other unjustly.
Yeah.
So he's trying to bridge the gap.
Yes.
Okay.
This is fascinating. How are you going to hold together this society, which is splintering along democratic versus aristocratic lines,
Right.
when society has been largely demilitarized following the archaic age?
Yes. Yeah. So
This is what Solon does. He says, I used a strong shield, a sakos. I held a shield over both groups, and by dint of his genius and legislation, made them get along.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I have to wonder with the, American election coming. Well, we shouldn't probably talk about that.
Yeah.
So wrapping it up then,
Yeah.
literary education, the notion of kalokagathia, Jeff. This is page 43, the ideal. What is kalokagathia?
Well, as Marrou writes at the bottom of page 43, the guiding ideal of this old education was still an ethical one. It can be expressed in one word, kalokagathia, being a man both beautiful and good.
So, but what does good mean?
Right. And so this is good. Agathos signifies the moral aspect, which was essential, as we have seen with the social and worldly implications which it had had from the very beginning. Beautiful, kalos, refers to physical beauty, and with the inevitable aura of eroticism that had come to accompany it. And here I, Marrou again saying, must try to explode the modern myth that Greek civilization achieved a harmonious synthesis between racial beauty, the highest artistic perfection, and the most elevated flights of speculative thought.
Well, that's interesting.
Well, so is he trying to say that kalos kagathia is a kind of a sound mind and a sound body?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Which is, of course, a quote from Juvenal.
Right.
Mens sana in corpore sano.
Yeah.
Yes. He's saying that's basically what it is. And he says, I must try to explode the modern myth that Greek civilization achieved a harmonious synthesis between, quote, racial beauty, the highest artistic perfection, and the most elevated flights of speculative thought. So in that part, Marrou tells us in the footnote, he's taking aim at, quote, a French vulgarizer of Nazi thought. A man named J.E. Spenle.
Okay.
So the idea is that somehow the Greeks were fixated on their own racial purity ideas, and somehow they developed this to a high degree. He says that's not really what's going on at all.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Dave, since we're up against it here, do you have a way that you can kind of wrap this chapter up for us?
I think so. Yep. So we're finishing with chapter 4. I guess we have to save the really great stuff in chapter 5 for next time?
Yep.
Okay. So Marrou says on page 44, I think this really encapsulates it. This ideal of a fully developed mind in a superb body, this is kalokagathia, may not be entirely imaginary. It was at least in Plato's mind when he was creating his unforgettable young men. And then he mentions a number that appear in the dialogues. And he says, but it must nevertheless be realized that if this ideal was ever achieved, it could only have been for a fleeting moment of unstable equilibrium between two opposite tendencies, that is, moral worth and physical beauty, which could only grow at each other's expense. A time was to come when Greek education would be, like ours, essentially intellectual, under the influence of men like Socrates, who was ugly, and Epicurus, whose health was poor. So what do you think of those claims? What do you make of that?
So is he? I mean, is he saying that education it moves away from the idea of kind of physical perfection fairly quickly?
Correct.
And it
because
becomes
it's unattainable,
right,
to cultivate the beauty of the body and the beauty of the mind simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested to see kind of where he goes with this. Right. I like how he ends that with Socrates and Epicurus, who were not beauties,
right,
in their own right. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of leave our audience kind of wondering and us thinking about these questions, and we'll pick this up in another episode.
Because we're up against it.
We are.
Okay, so we got to get out of here, Jeff, but we got to take care of a few housekeeping items.
Of course, right. So we have people to thank, as always. Mishka, our wonderful engineer, Ken Tamplin, Scott Van Zen for the great music you hear throughout the episode. Dave, you want to say a thing about the Moss method before we go?
I do, yes, and that is we got a great response to our Black Friday, Cyber Monday.
Excellent.
And we're going to have a New Year's Day sale.
All right.
January 1 coming up. Offer some similar discounts. So go to mossmethod.com, check out the program. Got a number of students matriculating through it very successfully.
Excellent.
Learning their Greek from psi to shining psi.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And latinperdiem.com/LLPSI if you want to study some Latin with me.
Excellent.
Now, these are self-paced courses, but they both feature weekly office hours where you can interact and ask me anything you want about any Greek or Latin author. Not to say I always have the answer, but I think I can find it, and we learn together.
And you also get to interact with students from around the world, right?
Oh, it's fantastic.
That sounds so cool. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, Jeff, if they want to subscribe, leave a review, what kinds of things should they do there?
They should write, if they want to write to you, they can write to you at dave@adnauseam.com. Don't forget the V.
Or write to Jeff at jeff@adnauseam.com. There's a V in ad nauseum. Yeah. You can pick up a nice T-shirt, quai nocent docent. And what's on tap for next week, Jeff?
We're thinking about doing a Christmas episode.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
I have some great ideas in the hopper. The schedule might be a little sketchy because we've both been under the weather,
and it's a crazy time of year. In terms of family and other demands.
But we're gonna see what we can do.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep.
All right, Jeff. I think you have the gustatory parting shot.
I do. This comes from the great John Steinbeck from his work Tortilla Flat.
Have you read Tortilla Flat?
No, I love.
Do you know what it's about?
I don't. I loved December. I loved East of Eden and Grace of Wrath, and
I read The Red Pony.
Oh, I haven't read that one.
I think that's the only Steinbeck I've read.
Yes, I've the stuff I've read is of his. I'm a big fan. But
if I can ask,
yes,
what is Tortilla Flat? Is this a place where he lived?
It sounds like,
or is this the opposite of? I mean, what would the opposite be?
Like a bulging tortilla?
Tortilla bumpy?
Bumpy? I don't know exactly.
Okay,
right. So I don't if the tortilla here was referring to food here, but the quote here refers to food.
It does.
Yes.
And so, it makes no sense to me.
Me either. But in Tortilla Flat, Steinbeck writes, "Beans are a warm cloak against economic cold."
I can just picture myself wearing a cloak of beans.
Yes. All I know is that a Pythagorean probably would not like.
He would not go for it. Thanks for listening.
Thanks.